Hi everyone, you're very welcome to today's discussion with Professor Brian Leiter at Trinity College Dublin. My name is Dawn Lyons, I'm with the School of Law at Trinity College. This is seminar 21 in our speaker series. So just to explain the format today, Professor Brian Leiter will do a 10-minute overview of the subject of our discussion today. Then I'll ask a couple of questions, and then Professor Brian O'Connor, Head of Department at UCD Philosophy, will come in with some remarks and questions, and then we'll have a Q&A towards the end. So any questions you have, feel free to put them in the Q&A box below. So first, by way of introduction, we're delighted to welcome Professor Brian Leiter to our Law School Speaker Series for a second time. Brian Leiter is Karl N. Llewellyn Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the Center for Law, Philosophy and Human Values at the University of Chicago Law School. He joined Chicago Law School in 2008 after 13 years at the University of Texas at Austin, where he was at the time the youngest chairholder in the history of the law school. He's also been a visiting professor of law at Yale University and the University of Paris X-Nanterre, as well as a visiting professor of philosophy at Oxford University and University College London. His teaching and research interests are in moral, political, and legal philosophy in both the Anglophone and continental traditions, as well as the law of evidence. His books include Nietzsche on Morality, Naturalizing Jurisprudence, Why Tolerate Religion, and Moral Psychology with Nietzsche. He's presently working on two books, one exploring realism in political and legal theory, which will be called From a Realist Point of View for Oxford University Press, and a co-authored book on Marx for Routledge. And I'm very happy to say that today we're talking about the philosophy of Karl Marx, and Professor Leiter will begin with an overview of some thoughts that he has put forward in several articles, and the links to those articles are available on the Law School events page. So I'll hand the floor over to you at this point, Professor Leiter.
Thank you very much, Donna, and thank you for having me back again. And congratulations on your excellent series of talks, which are available on YouTube for those who may have missed earlier ones. Trinity College Dublin did make available several of the papers, but I don't want to presuppose that people had an opportunity to look at that. So I want to say something in a slightly condensed form about what I take is central to understanding what Karl Marx was up to. Some of this will be very familiar to some of you, but hopefully for others it will help facilitate discussion and questions. The centerpiece of Marx's work is not a normative theory of justice or the good or what the right thing is that we ought to do. There is no Marxian analog, say, to Rawls's A Theory of Justice. Marx thought that that kind of normative moral and political philosophy was a pernicious waste of time, and it made no difference to actual practice. This isn't to say Marx didn't have normative views, and we may talk about some of those in due course, but the centerpiece of his effort was, as I like to say, a kind of descriptive explanatory theory about historical and economic change. And in particular, then, he wanted to have a descriptive explanatory account of how capitalism works and why, at its core, it is fundamentally irrational in the sense that by its own terms, it can't keep going the way it goes, the way it's been going. So I'm going to try to say something about each of those ideas. The general descriptive explanatory theory Marx puts forward is what he calls historical materialism. The idea of historical materialism is in one way very simple. It's that if you want to understand a society, you have to understand the level of development of its productive powers, right? Now, of course, human labor power is a relative constant throughout human history. Humans today are a little bigger and a little stronger than humans 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, but there's been not much growth in that productive power. The real changes in the productive power of human societies occur in the growth of what I'll just refer to as technology. And I mean that very capaciously. That includes tools, right? That includes, whether you have a bow and arrow or a gun. But that also includes the technology and the sources of power that, say, make possible the famous or infamous factories of the 19th century, steam power, water power, coal power, and so on. And all the way up to the present, say, where the computer, right, is an important innovation in technological and productive power for human beings. Marx's thought is that the level of development of the productive power of human societies plays a fundamental role in explaining almost everything else about that society. Right? The intuitive idea is really very simple, right? There's a big difference in life if you wake up in the morning and your first question is, will I be able to shoot a deer with my bow and arrow in order to feed my family? Versus waking up in the morning and saying, gee, what time will the groceries be delivered, right? Those two scenarios, right, reflect enormous differences in the productive powers of the societies in which those, as it were, are kind of the baseline questions first thing in the morning. According to Marx, Marx thinks of societies as stratified into sort of three levels. There are what he calls the forces of production, which I've been talking about. There are what he calls the relations of production. You can think of that as something like the system of property rights that is prevalent in a society. And in particular, right, of particular interest to Marx are the property rights that people have in the productive forces of the society. Right? So under capitalism, one of the distinguishing features of capitalism is that almost everyone has a property right in their own labor power, and they sell it for a wage. Right? Some people, capitalists in Marx's lingo, have property rights in a great deal more. Right? They have property rights in technology. Right? They have property rights in factories. They might have property rights in land. They might have property rights in raw materials. But most people, right, have fundamentally a right to sell their own labor power. Right? So every society has a certain set of relations of production, a certain distribution of property rights. And finally, each society is characterized by what Marx refers to as the ideological superstructure. These are the moral, political, religious, and importantly, philosophical ideas, right, that are prevalent in a society. One of Marx's most important theses that I think remains true to the present, certain things Marx thought were not true, but this is true, is that the dominant moral, political, religious, and philosophical ideas in societies, right, tend to be the ideas of what Marx calls the ruling class in that society. That is the class that owns, right, the most significant forces of production. Why do societies change? Why do economies change? According to Marx, change occurs when there is a growth in the productive power that is available in a society, say due to a scientific discovery, okay? There's a growth in productive power, but the existing class structure of the society, that is, and in particular, the current ruling class in that society is not in a position to make effective use or exploitation of those technological developments. Right? When that happens, Marx sometimes calls this a contradiction. This is because of the unfortunate fact that he read a lot of Hegel in his youth. It's not strictly speaking a contradiction. It's rather that he thinks the existing relations of production come to be a fetter on the further development of the productive forces, the further utilization of them, right? So feudalism, to speak in terms of a bit of a caricature, right? Feudalism, right? If you imagine the feudal lord with the peasants on the feudal estate, okay? Feudalism is not well set up for purposes of running a large factory with a power loom, right? If you're going to run a factory with the new power looms, then you have to have people who are legally entitled to sell their labor power to you, and you have to have them collected in a central place, like the city. Right? The peasants on the feudal estates couldn't sell their labor power, right? They did a kind of exchange with the feudal lord. They were spread out throughout the countryside. They were not available, as it were, for purposes of laboring in factories. Okay? So the feudal relations of production were not conducive to taking advantage of the new technological developments that marked the Industrial Revolution. This is a gross oversimplification because there's like a 200 or 300 period in between the real collapse of feudalism and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And it varies depending on what parts of Europe we're talking about. We can come back to that. Okay. Marx thinks the same thing is ultimately going to happen to capitalism. That is, there's going to come a point where capitalist relations of production are no longer conducive to the use of the existing productive powers. Why not? Marx has a couple of different stories about this. I want to emphasize just two, and I want to emphasize what's sort of intuitively sensible about it. One scenario that seems to be built into the logic of capitalism is the following, right? Which is that capitalists are interested in making a profit. This is one of Marx's key insights. Capitalism is all about chasing the money and getting more of it, okay? In order to make a profit, right, or rather to increase your profit margins, one way you could do that is, of course, to reduce your costs as a capitalist. One way to reduce your costs is to reduce the cost of human labor power, which is why capitalists are very keen to invest in technology that displaces human labor power. Okay. If capitalists keep doing that, right, that is replacing humans with robots and other things, right, there's going to be less opportunity for human beings to sell their labor power, which is the main way in which most human beings under capitalism live. They are, in Marx's terms, wage slaves, right? They work only in order to survive, not because the work is in any way meaningful or important to them. If you eliminate the need for human labor power through technology, right, you can indeed reduce your costs, but at the limit, you run into a problem, which is there's nobody left to buy anything, right? This is what in the Marxian lingo is sometimes called the problem of underconsumption, right? We'll have all this productive power, but no human beings who actually have any money to buy things except for a few other capitalists. Marx thought not unreasonably that this was a fundamentally unstable situation where a few people control all the productive power and most people are immiserated, either absolutely, that is, they're really poor, or relative to what could be available to them given the existing productive power. The other idea that Marx puts forward, especially in Capital, his last uncompleted work, was what he called the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. There are explanations for this that depend on contentious aspects of Marx's labor theory of value, which I'm not going to talk about because I think it's false, notwithstanding certain revisionary attempts to revive it. And I also don't think it matters. The basic intuitive idea behind the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is this, right? Which is that capitalists, as we were just talking about, have an interest in acquiring new technologies that will increase their ability to produce things and to produce them for less cost, right? And in the short term, a capitalist who's a first mover on acquiring new technology may do quite well, right? They can undersell all their competitors because their production costs are lower for the same goods. The problem, again, is in the logic of capitalism. Every single other capitalist in that line of business is going to have to invest in the same technology, right? And insofar as the technology increases the ability to produce things, you may have to invest in more raw materials as well because you can produce more things. So the result is, in the short term, some capitalists get ahead by investing in technology, but in the long term, their costs continue to go up, right? That, of course, puts more pressure on them to reduce the cost of human labor, which leads to the first problem. In either scenario, right, the profits, which are the raison d'etre of capitalism, the great secret of capitalism, right, which I want to emphasize Marx in one way greatly admire, right? Nobody loves capitalism more in one sense than Marx and my colleagues in the Chicago School of Economics. The difference is that Marx understands why the entire system is irrational and unstable. And my friends in the Chicago School haven't quite got that message. Okay, that was a lot of ideas in a very condensed form. There's lots of other things we can talk about, but I think I'm going to leave it to people to ask questions about any of this or things that I didn't touch on. Thanks, Donna.
Thanks so much, Brian. Yeah, it's very interesting. And I just have one question for you because I'm conscious there are lots of people on the webinar today, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. But I'm just interested in a debate that you participated in with another member of the Academy last March on the question of socialism, social democracy and capitalism in America and American society. And I'm wondering whether you would be interested in defining those terms as you defined them during that debate, and also just explaining your argument in relation to how you feel American society or the economy in America may develop along the lines of socialism in the near or distant future.
So Donna, I lost you there for about 10 seconds. I'm not sure what happened.
Sure, no problem.
You froze on my end.
Sorry, that might have been my connection. So I'm just wondering if you would define the terms socialism, social democracy and capitalism, and maybe reiterate for us your argument as to where you think American society and the American economy will go, what direction it will go in terms of possibly moving along socialist lines.
Okay, so, there was a great deal of interest in socialism in the United States because of the presidential campaign of Bernie Sanders. Sanders unfortunately called himself a socialist, even though he wasn't. The distinguishing feature of socialism is that there is collective, usually that means state control of the major forces of production in a society, right? And Bernie Sanders was generally not proposing anything of the kind, right? So in a socialist society, in different ways, right? So they might intervene, for example, with laws that protect the conditions under which workers have to labor. They might ban certain kinds of discrimination. But social democracies also operate, as it were, to counteract the effects of the lottery in life that we all find ourselves in, right? Because capitalist markets exploit and reward certain attributes, certain identities, certain skills, and people who lack them, right, often will find themselves unable to be effective wage slaves. That is, they won't be able to get wages adequate to what their needs are. Social democracies try to offset that through various schemes of social insurance. Socialism has nothing against schemes of social insurance, needless to say, but the real difference is who controls the productive power that a society has. It was crucial for Marx that socialism, or communism, as he called it, there are debates about what the differences are between these terms. I'm going to just use them as being equivalents. Marx was quite clear that he thought that socialism was only possible under conditions of massive productive power, right? And this was the great thing about capitalism, is it was very good at developing the productive power available to humankind. It was very stupid about how it's utilized ultimately, but it was very good at developing productive power. Therefore, you can only have socialism when you have very, very substantial productive power in which you can meet most people's needs, right, with relative ease, right? We can debate how easy it has to be. This, of course, is the irony of most of the 20th century regimes that self-identified as socialist or communist. They were all installed under circumstance in countries that hadn't really undergone capitalist development. Right? Indeed, as some of you will know, between 1921 and 1928 in the Soviet Union, they actually instituted limited amounts of capitalism, which was a correct reading of Marx. That wasn't the entire motivation, This ended with, Stalin, who of course was a sociopath and a sadistic paranoid maniac. But Lenin instituted this initially, and I think that was actually the correct thing to do. Mao, Castro, and some of the others didn't seem to get that part of Marx particularly straight, or they didn't really care. But Marx thought you can't really have socialism without first having capitalism. Will we have socialism in America? Unlike Marx, I'm not optimistic that history has a happy ending. Unlike Hegel, who thought history also had a happy ending. I'm hopeful, but it could go many, many different ways. I'm not sure we yet have the productive power that would be essential for successful socialism, but I think we're way closer now than Marx thought we were in the middle of the 19th century.
Thank you so much. And without further ado, I'll hand the floor over to Professor Brian O'Connor, Head of Department at UCD School of Philosophy.
Thank you very much, Donna. Thank you very much, Brian. I just have a few general questions that I hope bring the conversation in a slightly different direction at first. But let me start with where you were. And I think it's your view that Marx believes that because capitalism will collapse, when effectively it saturates the world, when there's no competitive advantage possible anymore, it'll simply run out of steam. That's on the one side. And something I think you mentioned in one of the papers was that the miserable condition of the workers will be such that eventually the penny drops and they come to realize that the system is exploitative. Now, what strikes me though in all of that is that I could even believe that, but I still might think there would be good reason to have normative theory as well, for the simple reasons that you're going to have to try to make sense of the mess, and you're going to have to try to make sense of how to move beyond it without reproducing it. And I'm no Rawlsian, as you probably know, but people are going to have to sort of adumbrate some sense of what the good might be, let's to put it in those grand terms, of try to inventorize the habits of thought they picked up as fully socialized members of a capitalist society, so that they don't reproduce those in a better society. So there might be space for normative theory there. That's one question. And the other question is just on the empirical speculations about the saturation point. I mean, would you agree that Marx, I guess like everyone else for a long time, underestimated our insatiable desire for new things? No matter where you go, you see the scenes of destitution across the world, and yet you see people with mobile phones and various appliances that have become a necessity in their life. And surely there will be new products and new prestigious consumer goods that people want, and the whole system, which is fantastically good at generating needs. And so it can never basically saturate itself to exhaustion.
Good. Both very fair questions. Let me start with the second one and then go back to the question about normative theory. It is a problem, potentially a very serious problem, for the descriptive explanatory theory about the problems with capitalism, that people's wants may in fact be insatiable. I want to distinguish for a moment between their needs and their wants. I understand people can come to feel they need things, right? That originally started off merely as luxury items or whatever, okay? But, we can distinguish at least between, as it were, the basic needs, right? The kind of needs for which people become wage slaves, right? To eat, to have housing, to have clothes, to be able to feed their children, and so on and so forth. And then the other things that they may come to want. As you know, Brian, and I commend everyone, Brian O'Connor's book on Adorno in the Routledge Philosophers series. So Brian O'Connor is the real Frankfurt School expert here, not me. But as the people in the Frankfurt School, including Adorno, noted, capitalism was particularly good at manufacturing wants in people, right, which the market could then satisfy, right? And so the Frankfurt School had this kind of, nightmare scenario, which they thought we were in. I think we're still in it, right? In which people are in a kind of just daze, right? That the market keeps generating things they want and then delivering it. And so people are in this kind of stupefaction of satisfaction, right? And they don't think about, whether they're doing anything worthwhile or purposeful with their lives. This is a real risk. Are all our wants insatiable? Are we going to keep developing new wants in response to new trinkets that the market, right, kicks up? Possibly. There may come a point where societies will have to decide that it's time to harness productive power in a way that eliminates the satisfaction of some of the more frivolous wants. And this will require some judgments about which wants are the most important ones and which ones are least important. And maybe that will even drive us back into, this is your first question, normative theory. Okay? Now, a couple things to say about that. Marx thought that moral and political philosophy was part of what he called the ideological superstructure. And of course, in his day, he had Hegel particularly in mind, but also Jeremy Bentham. And he thought these were the right moral political philosophies for the particular stage of economic development that Prussia and England were in at those times. Hegel, of course, somewhat notoriously, right, was naturally read as offering a rationalization for the Prussian state and the existing distribution of political and economic power and so on, right? As in, the preface to the philosophy of right. Now, of course, that doesn't mean it's impossible, right, to have a normative theory that doesn't do that, right? Though I will say, if we look at the kind of normative theory that the Western Academy has been offering up, it doesn't look that different. It looks different from Hegel in a number of ways, but not in terms of its relationship to the status quo. A lot of academic moral philosophy now is extremely close to what I would view as questions about etiquette. And indeed, we even have moral philosophers writing books defending the importance of norms of etiquette. If you think, as Marxists do, that the real issue is the fundamental economic system under which we live and operate, then this doesn't seem to be a very good advertisement for doing normative theory. Of course, it's possible that in conditions of a society that was not a class-based society, meaning, right, that doesn't mean, right, not a society where some people are smarter than others, or some people are more handsome than others, or better looking than others. No, a society in which it's not the case that some people, private individuals, control the major forces of production that produce everything we need, right? So not a classless, a non-class society in the sense that the old ruling class is no longer a factor. Maybe in a society that is a classless society in that sense, a useful kind of normative theory would arise. I'm not sure, though, that we need normative theory in order not to reproduce the problems of the old order, right? Because Marx thought, and I agree with him about this, that the problems of the old order fundamentally have to do with, problems of scarcity, right? And if you have the productive power that eliminates scarcity, right, you've taken care of the most important issue. I like to use the following image. It's a bit silly and fantastical, but I think it drives home the point. I mean, imagine that we develop the productive power where you could simply push a button and manna falls from heaven, right? And in some ways, something like this utopian thought is lurking in Marx, that capitalism really did have the potential to give us that kind of productive power, right? Well, at that point, when you can just push the button to have your basic needs met and maybe a bunch of your wants too, right? Including a few of your frivolous wants, as it were. not entirely clear what work a normative theory is going to be doing. Now, it's fair to say that Marx was assuming something. He did assume that human beings wanted to engage in productive activity. And he did assume that they would engage in spontaneous productive activity when they didn't need to work solely to survive. Right? And maybe this will turn out to be an overly optimistic view about what human beings will do when presented with plenty. I think one reason Marx is silent on a lot of these things is because, going back to his historical materialism, he really does think that the ideas you can have about the good and the just and the right and what kind of life is worthwhile are profoundly affected by the economic circumstances under which you live. And people who lived under fundamentally different economic circumstances, post-capitalist circumstances, it's hard to say in advance what views they're gonna have about these questions. Maybe they will do lots of normative theory in the socialist utopia of the future if we get to it.
One other issue, I have some thoughts on that, but maybe I'll talk to you about that another time, because another big issue you raise, and I suppose it's loomed a little larger for me in view of your pessimism about the eventual collapse of capitalism, is that in the meantime, as somebody once put it, what is to be done? And you have some very trenchant criticisms of effective altruism. Now, I think those criticisms are really well made, and I agree with them. But given that they might make a difference whilst capitalism is still keeping itself going very effectively for the next couple of centuries, in realistic terms, isn't there something to recommend them?
Something to recommend?
If the policy of, I think it's called effective altruism, isn't it?
Oh, I see. Effective altruism, right? Is the idea associated with Peter Singer and some philosophers at Oxford.
Yeah, and as I say, I think your criticisms are powerful, but in view of your pessimism about the realization of something amounting to some kind of justice, it's some kind of realistic compromise, isn't it? Or is it unacceptable even in that context?
Yeah, so I'll tell you why I'm very skeptical about so-called effective altruism. The idea is that we all have obligations to basically give money to charities of various kinds, and we ought to do so effectively in ways that maximize the bang for our buck. I say so-called effective altruism because it's not really effective altruism, it's really measurable altruism, right? They want to know what things can we do as individuals that help others that we can measure, okay? And if we can't measure it, it doesn't exist as far as effective altruists go. Even in the short term, right? Let's say the next century. It seems to me that we know from, as it were, the natural experiments that the world has offered up, that social democratic societies do better by their populations along any metric of well-being you want to pick just about, than societies that are not social democracy. I'm talking about, the wealthy capitalist societies. It's a more complicated question about societies that are not yet wealthy capitalist societies. But within the wealthy capitalist societies, it's clear that most people in the United States would be much better off if the US were more of a social democracy like Ireland, frankly, or like Germany. Now, there's a large ideological apparatus devoted to obscuring that truth, right? But given that, it does seem to me that the real issues is not which charity I can give to, but which political actions can I take and which political party can I support that is going to bring about social democracy, right? I do not tend to give money to American political candidates, but I did give money to Bernie Sanders. And I even gave money to Liz Warren because she was basically a social democratic candidate or a New Deal liberal in the Franklin Roosevelt sense, right? From which the Democratic Party has retreated in large part. So I can't tell you how to measure the impact of my political contributions or my political advocacy on the blog, right? But I'm quite sure that the impact there of an actual transformation in policy at the level of the US federal government, which is huge and very powerful, right? Any little move you make to social democracy at that level is going to dwarf anything you could do by giving to UNICEF or to pay for mosquito nets or whatever whatever the current fad is among the effective altruists, right? But I'll grant you it's a little harder to measure. So that's my view.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron.
Thanks so much. Professor Brian O'Connor, do you have any more questions or comments, or should we move into Q&A? You think you're muted still.
Yes, please do. I'd be delighted to come back if there's time at the end, but I'm sure there are people there who are anxious to get involved as well.
That sounds great. Thank you so much for those brilliant questions. So first of all, we have Marta Lasek-Markey with us, who's a PhD student funded by the Irish Research Council, and before her time as a PhD student, she was had a career in journalism. And Marta has a question for you, Brian. So I'm just sorry, I'm trying to promote you to panelist. I think it's working. Hi. Okay. Whenever you're ready, Marta, go ahead.
Good evening. Thank you, Professor Leiter. That was really interesting. I just want to say that I'm not a philosopher, but my research kind of revolves around precarious work, and many of the authors who write about precariousness or precarity often refer to Marx. And so I was particularly struck with what Marx thought about technology, even though I'm sure he understood it slightly differently than we do nowadays. But in this context, I wonder, when we think about these new kind of forms of work, particularly, say, these platform workers in the so-called gig economy, so like Uber drivers, how would Marx explain this phenomenon? Would he say that this is kind of sort of the first step, although driven by a capitalist, that could ultimately lead to their demise?
A very simple answer is yes, but now let me give a more complex answer. The rise of precarious work, right, is the kind of thing that Marx would have predicted. Now, here's something, right, Marx did not predict. Marx did not predict the rise of social democracy. He did not predict the rise of labor unions. He underestimated very substantially the ability of the capitalist class to strike bargains through the political and legal system to keep the system going. Okay? But given the logic of capitalism, right, which is to reduce costs, increase profits, right? Every capitalist is operating under this imperative. Any capitalist who says, I don't care about reducing costs, I'm not that interested in profits, will go out of business, right? They will go out of business. Given the basic imperative of capitalism, precarious work, right, is a step on the road to the gradual immiseration of workers, right? So take Uber drivers in the United States. I don't know what their legal situation is in Ireland, right? You know, the capitalists who own Uber, right, have been very insistent that their workers are not their workers, right? That they are independent contractors, so they do not get all kinds of economic and legal protections that someone working in the Ford motor plant would get. Big issue for Uber and the others is to make sure those precarious workers are treated as independent contractors, reduces the labor costs. This is why it's so appealing to them. They fought bitterly to prevent California, which is a more social democratic state within the US. They fought bitterly when California wanted to change those rules. California did actually change the rules, okay? So why are we seeing the rise of precarious work? Because technology makes it possible and it reduces the cost to capitalists to have precarious workers rather than workers who are entitled to benefits, who are entitled to a pension and so on and so forth. We will see an increase in precarious work. That would be my prediction. Will it be possible to strike another bargain between the precarious working class and the capitalist class with respect to legal protections and the redistribution of wealth, similar to what happened in the middle of the 20th century? Predictions are not my strong suit. But the precarity of work is going to become much more common. And it's even going to reach, by the way, university professors. It already has to some extent. The Zoom revolution that we have all been forced into because of the pandemic may accelerate this in some measure. So in that sense, precarity is exactly what Marx would expect in labor markets under capitalism, because it's a very good way to reduce labor costs for capitalists, even though they still need a bit of human labor power there. Someone's got to drive the car. But by the way, driverless cars are coming, right? And that will be that will allow Uber to lower its costs even more. Uber will simply have to invest in the cars and not have to bother about those human beings.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marta. And we have Sam in the audience. Sam, I might try to promote you to a panelist, but if you would like to just prefer me to read your, if you would prefer me to read your question, I will do that and just keep your camera off. Otherwise, you are welcome to speak directly to Brian. See,
All right, I know this, Sam.
Hi.
Hi, Dad. I didn't have a particular question. I suppose, given the current state of U.S. politics, what do you think the likelihood of the Biden administration being able to put forward a sort of stabilizing path for U.S. capitalism is, and how do you see the risks to capitalism going forward in the United States?
Again, this is a predictive question. My son studies political science, so he should probably really have to answer the question. You know, I'm not very optimistic about the short term, but you know, the long term is always harder to say. You know, in the immediate short term, right, the policies of the Democratic Biden administration are determined by a senator from West Virginia, Joe Manchin, who is a Democrat but somewhat conservative, right? And since the Democrats barely have a majority in the United States Senate, one of the two houses of Congress, they have to adjust their agenda accordingly. They can't lose certain kinds of votes. So that puts an immediate constraint on what's going to happen. If after 2022 the Democrats have a bigger majority in the Senate, well, you know, certainly all the demographics of the United States. This is why Republicans in the United States have only one real agenda item, which is to prevent people from voting, right? Because all the demographics in the United States favor Bernie Sanders, as it were, right? That is, his support was very high, for example, among young people. You know, the social democratic agenda he stands for will probably gain momentum, right? And of course, if the United States splits up, as I increasingly think is likely, then we may get the social democracy sooner in the civilized parts of the United States, and God help us in the other parts. So stay out of the other parts, Sam.
Thanks so much. And I think I need to apologize because there were two questions from a Sam, and perhaps that's a different Sam altogether, because the first one corrected us when we were talking about international relations and said international relations started out as race relations. So I thought that was you referring to your own PhD. And then there was another question from this Sam. Hello to the other Sam. And this other Sam was asking, there has been more throwing about of brains on Marx's thinking than that of anyone else, and sadly the results have not been salutary. There's a long list of those who became disenchanted with the enormous variety of ideas that Marx advocated for, in parentheses, often contradictory. Should we now move on as Merleau-Ponty advocated in the 50s? So apologies, I thought that was your question, Samuel, but that was an excellent question, and thank you for joining.
Yeah, Merleau-Ponty is a funny one to cite in this regard, because Merleau-Ponty was an utterly insane communist. Even if he was a Stalinist. It's very hard to find someone to have offered as unembarrassed a set of apologies for Stalin than Merleau-Ponty. But I put aside that little ad hominem. I was just surprised to see Merleau-Ponty there. Yeah, there is a vast literature of Marxology, and it is of extremely mixed quality. This is part of the reason I started by talking about Marx and not about Marxism. You know, because I think, you know, part of the problem that befell Marx is he became too famous for his own good, right? And he, you know, and some people have adopted an almost, you know, I would say religious attitude towards Marx, right? That if we could just figure out what Marx thought and get it clear, then, you know, then we reach heaven on earth. And I don't think that's a healthy way to approach any significant philosophers or thinkers. Marx did indeed make mistakes. A lot of them are traceable to the influence that Hegel had on him, in my view. You know, I do think at the core of Marx, there's a lot of very important and interesting ideas that are still relevant today in thinking about the shape and structure of the world. I would be glad to excise a great deal of the so-called Marxist theory that occurred in the interim, though not the core of the Frankfurt School. People like Adorno, I wouldn't put them in that category. But you know, the world could have lived without Lukács, but not every Marxist may share that opinion. And Lukács did write a few good things, despite also being a rather unappealing political personality. So there's a lot we could say about that, but maybe I'll leave it at that.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much. I think I'll read out the remainder of the questions because there are quite a few, and maybe you could just pick one or two to answer in the time.
No, don't read them all. Let's just pick. There's no point. There's too many questions.
No problem. Okay, let me ask Sarah Wexler's question. So Sarah says that you spoke about the issue of underconsumption, but doesn't Marx instead stress the issue of overproduction? Second, how do you feel about Pashukhani's commodity form analysis of law? And do you think that there are other ways Marxists should study and analyze law?
Okay. So in one way of understanding it, overproduction is just the flip side of underconsumption, right? Producing things that nobody can buy. But I grant that's not the only sense in which we can talk about it in Marxian economics. And so I didn't say much about the other senses in this context. Pashukhani was probably the most important Marxist legal philosopher of the 20th century. For his efforts, he was executed by Stalin. Notwithstanding that, his treatise on the Marxist theory of law is bad in many respects. It wouldn't be my go-to source for understanding how Marx thinks about law. I think Marx himself was not always entirely clear on law. I mean, he sometimes refers to law as part of the ideological superstructure, but that's just incorrect in his own terms, because law in capitalist societies is constitutive of the relations of production. So it can't purely be part of the ideological superstructure. So I think we have to distinguish between different parts of law. I think the crucial thing from the Marxian standpoint is to understand the way in which law operates, right, to stabilize and promote relations of production that are needed by capitalism, okay? And in a way, Marta's question before gave us a perfectly good example of that, right? That is, the legal battle over the rights of precarious workers fit the Marxian picture quite well. Namely, the capitalists want to resist, right, granting precarious workers the kinds of rights, entitlements, and benefits that the capitalist class had to grant to ordinary industrial workers, 50, 70, 80, 90 years ago, right? They're desperately trying to resist that. And on the other side, right, the precarious workers have an interest in at least acquiring those kinds of loosely social democratic protections for their working conditions. this kind of thing, I think, plays out in almost every area of law in different ways. But I think it's most vivid in areas like employment law, right? Which go to the crux of the relationship between wage slaves and capitalists in modern society. So,
Thanks so much. Will we do one more question?
sure.
Yeah.
If we can do more than one, if we have time for more than one.
Perfect. So Robert Bornholtz asks or says that guaranteed basic income could enable capitalism to continue, but conservatives could be happy with this because scarcity is not eliminated by productive power. There remains scarcity of talent and beauty and excellent ideas. How people spend the newly freed leisure time, whether the activities people do express ideas of higher goods and are recognized as excellent, defines a new elite. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Okay, so I do think, let me give what I take to be Marx's thoughts partly about that. You know, cultural production also admits of a kind of Marxist analysis, right? And so it is possible that the standards of beauty and the standards of taste are also themselves affected by the economic context in which culture develops. I think later Marxists have been more strongly committed to this view than Marx himself was. Marx himself was, in one sense, had some pretty traditional views about aesthetic excellence, and you know, and didn't really subject art and aesthetics to the same kind of analysis that he subjected morality or religion, not to the extent to which, say, later writers in the Marxist tradition have. You know, the fact that universal basic income has gotten on the political agenda, even to some extent in the United States, is again, I think, indicative of what's going on in the evolution of capitalism, right? Which is that it's becoming apparent to more and more people that there's no guarantee that capitalist markets will actually have any use for large numbers of people, and that this is lies in our future, as it were. The actual proposals for universal basic income are completely inadequate to meet even people's basic needs, let alone some of their wants, let alone their newly created wants, to go back to Brian O'Connor's question. But yes, one scenario that could emerge is one in which the capitalist class agrees, in effect, to a large subsidy to the consumers of their products out there in the form of something like a universal basic income, but at a more substantial level. That is a possible temporary piece that might be secured. But I think it's, you know, again, we're getting into the realm of prediction here, and I can't say I'm confident that that's the way it's going to go. I think what's interesting is that the discussion of universal basic income has become so much more politically palatable than it was even just 5 years ago, right? And I think that reflects a kind of anxiety that even the capitalist class is aware of the dilemma that may be on the horizon.
Could I just come in on that and just turn the question back to, because yeah, I think the question of universal basic income is fascinating. And you know, it might very well be something that eventually will be very pleasing to those who already have the monopoly of power and wealth, because of it, let's say, whole groups, whole sections of society that become idle and reproduce idle families and so on, and they might have a certain kind of peaceful existence, but politically they would be completely powerless. They wouldn't have never gotten into the practice of competing politically. So it would leave society for pretty much as it is, except in a completely extreme form. It often makes me think of that sort of awful reality in H.G. Wells, where you have what you call the Morlocks and the Alloys and these post-human races, where there's the superior one and the completely innovated one. I think you would probably agree that Marx would regard universal basic income as a completely ideological smokescreen.
Oh, yes, right. There's no question, right, that it's, this is why I put it in terms of the capitalist class might agree to it as a kind of compromise to sustain things. I certainly don't think it's in any way a Marxian proposal, as it were. What's interesting is it's symptomatic of what's happening under capitalism, that people even feel forced to talk about it, that even the capitalist media report on it, right? In a way, for example, the capitalist media don't report on the proposal that the Koch brothers, you know, and Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos should have their billions expropriated from them in order to meet human needs. Nobody ever says that. You can't hear that on the major media. Perfectly reasonable proposal, it seems to me, right? But it's outside the ideological spectrum at this point. The fact that universal basic income is within the ideological spectrum is symptomatic of the fact that even the ruling classes and the media that they own realize there's a problem, right? There's a problem brewing that they're going to have to solve in order to maintain something like the status quo.
Yeah, there's so much more to talk about here, and I see plenty of really fascinating questions in the Q&A, but we'll have to come back to this discussion another day. So I'd just like to thank Professor Leiter, also thanks to Professor Brian O'Connor and to Marta Lasek-Markey, also to Sam Leiter, and apologies for putting you in the spotlight there by accident, but that was an excellent contribution. And thanks to everyone for fantastic questions and feedback. So again, just like to express my really sincere gratitude to you, Brian Leiter, for sharing your insights with us this evening. It's been a great privilege to speak with you a second time, and this topic touches on important issues relating to socialism, social democracy, capitalism, and the continuing importance of the philosophy of Karl Marx. So we look forward to the publication of your forthcoming book on Marx with Routledge. And is there anything else that you or Professor Brian O'Connor would like to raise before we finish up?
No, thank you again for having me. Thanks to Brian O'Connor for some very nice questions, and thank you to the audience. I hope you got something out of it. And the book, which will be meant to be an introductory book, will, I hope, be out in 2022. And while you're waiting, you can read Brian O'Connor's book on Adorno in the same series, which is the best thing you'll ever read on Adorno, I promise. Thanks so much, Donna.
Hopefully we'll have a webinar on that separately at some point. Thank you so much to all of you. And with that, I'll close the session.
Bye-bye.